really exciting panel here. We have a panel about game narrative. So we chose this topic because it's something that not a lot of schools really dive deep into, and these amazing people, be it narrative designers or writers, right? They have so much wealth of information to share. So moderating is Nicholas Chan, who's a freelance writer, but he was also the lead writer for Masquerada Songs and Shadows. And then we have Fami, who is an indie developer. He wrote the famous Coffee Talk. So if you haven't played it, you should go check it out. And then we have Clara, who is an associate arts professor at New York University, also a dear friend from the Singapore MIT Gambit Game Lab many years ago. And then finally, we have Cassandra Kaur, amazing writer and now a senior scriptwriter at Ubisoft Montreal. So thanks, panelists. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm just going to spend like 2 minutes to make sure that everybody, all the people who are supposed to be on the panel are here. Can everybody give
I found my way to the correct stage.
Cass had a bit of a fright just now because she came in and she was like, she thought this was going to be the green room, and then turned on the camera and she's so embarrassed. But Cass, I promise.
Hey, there was a live panel. I felt like walking onto stage at the wrong point of history, just like turning around, going, oh no, and just trying to quietly slide off.
All right, so let's see if Clara is here already. Clara, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Okay, great. Let me adjust this little thing. Okay, great. So we've only got an hour, which I know is not a lot of time. So let's just dive right in. Thank you so much, Gwen, for introducing everybody, and thank you all for having us here. So today we're going to be talking about the importance of narrative, and I think a great way for us to start talking about narratives is, to ask the big question: why should people care about narratives in games? And that's a really, really broad question. But I think it'd be, interesting to hear all of your responses to that about, why are narratives important to you specifically?
A long silence as everyone stares at each other, trying to figure out who needs to start.
Let's go with Clara. Clara, do you want to begin?
Okay. Can you see me? I'm not seeing my video.
Yeah, so I can see you if I. Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, I mean, I come from having been a teacher for a long time. Part of my relationship with Singapore was just being part of the Singapore MIT Gambit Game Lab many years ago. And even back then, I was teaching narrative, and I'm making narrative games. And what I realized as an instructor, but also as a game writer and narrative designer, is that we really do care about the stories in games. Like what I'm seeing with the students who come to study with me is that they like games because of their stories, because of the worlds. And I think that the part of it, like the importance of having narrative in games, and narrative can be many things. I don't know if we'll be able to kind of break down what that is creating worlds that we're going into, that we're participating in, and that we can explore. And I think that kind of like is taken for granted that that's what is compelling to a person who wants to play games. It's not only just the graphics or the gameplay or like the challenge. It's like, I'm going to travel, I'm going to be transported, I'm going to go somewhere that I cannot go to otherwise. So I think that part of what kind of compels us to play games is those stories, is the stories that the games can tell, but also our own stories when we're part of them, like how we tell other people what we've done in a game. Streaming, for example, part of the compelling thing of streaming is that we are watching people that are experiencing their own stories on, while playing. So yeah, I think that this idea of like why narratives, like of course narrative, I think that's the answer. That it's a very exciting space. I think if all of us in the panel today come from other media, for me, stories in games is almost like natural because, I studied literature and theater, and I've studied comics and film and TV. So for me, like I care about narrative across the media. So games are just one more space where I can experience, and think in storytelling terms. And as we're going to see, we have not quite figured everything out, but that's part of the excitement of narrative games too. It's an exciting space to be in.
Thank you, Clara. I really love that. Cass, you look like you had something you want to say.
I was going to say the problem with being on a panel with an academic is they're so eloquent and they get everything across so perfectly, and you kind of end up going, crap. But the importance, I guess, of narrative in games to me is, in a lot of ways, they present a safe environment to explore different lives, different experiences. I grew up kind of around the time the internet started becoming popular, and I remember just kind of diving into a lot of books, into a lot of media, and trying to find myself in a lot of other different mediums. Obviously, as a Chinese Malaysian, looking into white Hollywood for that and the Eurocentric nature of publishing, I did not discover much of it. And it's also kind of limited because the people who had the privilege to create things, they were very often from a different and very specific class of folk. And so what you see in those mediums is a very narrow view of the world, but games, as it expands, allows us to explore so many other lives, to experience empathy for so many other situations. There was a mobile game some time ago that stuck with me so very deeply. I think it was Bury Me Softly, Love. I cannot remember the exact title. And it was basically this almost phone exchange between a husband and a wife. Both of them were refugees, if I'm not mistaken, and they're trying to communicate, trying to reassure each other through enormous distances, and it was just incredibly powerful. I've never been married that way. I've never experienced war that way or life that way. And being able to step in someone else's shoes for a minute was a staggering moment. Bury Me, My Love. Yes, thank you. That one. And games, I think, is important for that. With globalization having become a permanent thing in society, it lets us ensure that we have sufficient empathy for all parts of the world.
Yeah, I think Cass and Clara already explained why narrative in video games is so important. But for me, it's basically like one of our primary needs. We as a human, we need food, clothing, housing, and stories. That's why we read and watch the news. That's why we talk to our friends. That's why we watch movies and other stuff. And game is just like one of the medium to tell that stories, and you can do it interactively. And the thing is, it's one thing that will make your game memorable. You can have the best gameplay ever, but even game with a lot of problems, with interesting narrative, it can be something that is memorable to everyone who played it. Like, for example, Super Mario Bros. It's a very good game. It's a legendary game. And even though it's one of the most well-designed platformer ever, one of the things that is most popular about that game is the one line that says the princess is in another castle. It's not even a well-written line, but it starts with people, and it becomes something else. It becomes a torture, just that one line. That's how important narrative is, I think.
I really like that. Thank you, panelists, for sharing with us why you believe narratives are important in games. I think we've come to a point where people are in agreement. So much money gets put into, writing and cinematics and all these tools that people use to tell narratives. And I think everyone understands that narratives have a lot of power and can be very, very powerful. Really quickly, before we move on to the next question, I just have a small side question, which is, can each of you share with us when did a well-conceived video game narrative affect you personally? Just so we can get a sense of, your personal tastes and get a few nice stories. And what was that experience like for each of you?
I mean, it's hard to kind of define just one, but I always tell the story of me playing The Secret of Monkey Island with my brother when I was a kid, and the feeling of fighting the ghost pirate LeChuck at the end. Spoilers for the end of the game. You have to fight him by spraying root beer on him. But, I'm from Spain. And, I was in Spain playing the game in Spanish, and root beer was not a thing in Spain. And we kind of missed a couple of the clues about root beer floats because it's not something that we have in Spain. And all I can remember is like us just yelling and screaming in terror because Ghost Pirate LeChuck was coming from us. And it's less about the storytelling. I think that this is why it's important to think about narrative in games, not only as a craft, as a kind of one way, I'm the author, and then we have the player, experience our genius. There's part of it that is less about the writing of the game itself and more about, our terror and our own story and our own reaction to the game itself, rather than just, the game is very funny, the game is really compelling, it has aged pretty well given the circumstances, and yet I think that it was the moment of sharing, playing the game together, and a game that is not necessarily multiplayer, that really has made that moment of gameplay kind of stick with me.
For me personally, I always wanted to tell stories. I've been writing that story since I can write, which is when I was like 6 years old. From like bad comic books to bad short stories, but the moment where I want to make something that can affect someone emotionally happened when I was in fresh. Yeah, I just left my house, go to Malaysia to study, and then I played this Japanese RPG called Suikoden 5. And there's a scene where the main character parents, spoiler alert, they sacrifice themselves to save the hero. And it was a not super sad, but it's a very sad scene. It affects me personally, and it made me remember my parents at home, which makes me like start. The next day, I immediately called them, which is I rarely did, even until now. But that moment, video game made me call my parents because of like less than 5 minutes since I was like, I can do this. I can change, not really change, I can affect people emotionally with video games, and this is what I want to do, this is what I want to make.
I've been pondering my answer for this for a few days now. I had a previous answer, but in terms of a well-conceived piece of narrative that really struck me, the opening to Life is Strange 2 probably still gets to me. I've mentioned it in several talks already. And the reason for that was it was just an enormously powerful moment. I was in a friend's house in New Orleans. They gave me access to their Xbox Game Pass, and I was just kind of browsing through games. I saw Life is Strange 2. And I was like, you know what? I enjoyed the first one. I'm going to start it. And I did. And it was an interesting moment because it was also the day that I realized I am definitely getting old. This opening sequence with two teenagers talking about very teenage things had me just sighing over and going like, now, why am I here? But because I spent so much time as a gamer, my first instinct was I have to get to a natural save point. I need to get to a proper stop. I cannot just stop here. I need to follow this. So feeling deeply cynical, bored out of my mind, just kind of listless, I followed through with the opening of the game. I got to the house. I got to the sequence where the main character had to decide between his father and his little brother. There was like a piece of a candy bar, and it needed to be given to one or the other. I chose the third option. I took it for myself, and then they let me loose it within the house. And what surprised me was how the narrative worked then. I had to look for supplies for a party. So I started rummaging through the cupboards. I started looking around, and all the little details, the mention of the father's favorite spaghetti recipe, the pile of clothes in the laundry room, the little things here and there, the rooms, opening the doors, and going downstairs to talk to my character's father, and seeing him under a car working on it, just, you know, just a daily banal life, and the rhythms of it, just that casual conversation, the way they crafted it. By the end of 20 minutes, I went from, I'm just going to get to a save point and stop here, to, oh my God, I need to see this entire game through. Because they kind of use the rhythms of natural life, and they use that to kind of almost step past the barrier of disbelief and to kind of just slide into the skin. And you're somehow going from a stranger to wearing this person's life and just being thoroughly invested in everything he had to care about. And just, that stuck with me. I'm not normally the type of person who clings onto a piece of media after I've decided I'm done with it, but Life is Strange 2 completely upended my expectations on that.
Yeah, I really like that. Thank you everyone for sharing those stories. I think, you know, one thing that gets highlighted by hearing these stories is sort of, you know, we take it for granted that narrative is important, but I think it's always useful to remember why. You know, what can a good narrative do? A good narrative can change the relationship you have with other people, can, you know, sink you into the story so much, you know, more than a game with the same game without that narrative could. So I think I really love those stories. Thank you all. And now, let's get into the meat and potatoes of it. We're all invested. We all want to tell good stories. I think a great question is how, and I mean this career-wise. What does the career landscape look like for people who are interested in exploring narratives in video games? You know, we have the idea of, like, you know, narrative designers and, you know, game writers as like a very broad term, but I think it would be really useful for us to talk about how these things are sort of, you know, broken down, if they are broken down, and sort of, you know, give people an idea of how they, or what they should be aiming for and how to get into those things. Yeah, Clara, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so the thing is that when we talk about, game narrative jobs and positions, there's like a whole range. The kind of main two divisions are usually, it can be a game writer, which, you know, if you come from a background of fiction writing, dramatic writing, you know, some of our panelists do, you know, there is a lot of overlap in, you know, writing dialogue, you know, cutscenes or things like those. But the truth is, like, writing for games can be a lot more than that. You have to write maybe the blurbs for the game. Maybe you have to write things like barks, which is one of those things that goes against a lot of the things that you're taught in traditional fiction writing and dramatic writing. So there's that's kind of like what people understand as being a game writer. Things are changing now, but game writers used to come like late in the development of a game. But now, you know, the story, because it's part of the world, it has to be part of the beginning of it. But then there's also the narrative designer, and I think that everyone here, you know, we kind of identify as narrative designers as well. And that's a kind of more wishy-washy space where, like, not even the industry knows what a narrative designer is. They usually think that game writers and narrative designers are the same, and at times they come interchangeable. But narrative design is a discipline where you are helping create the world of a game and the systems and how the narrative interwaves with the systems, so that you're not only just writing dialogue, which can be part of it, but like being part of conversations in art, in design, in sound. So it's a more interdisciplinary, you know, it's almost part of a production as well. And again, you know, it's something that even the industry itself is a bit, you know, doesn't know what it is yet. And I think that actually a couple of days ago, Sasha Duval on Twitter was talking about, you know, what she wanted to see in a portfolio using Twine, for example, if you want to apply to a game company. And she was very good at explaining that it's not only being able to use Twine or designing choices, but like how you're trying to create mechanics just with Twine, you know, like things like dealing with anxiety, for example. How do you model that as a system, as a narrative system? How do you create tension? How do you make a game about being like a scatterhead, for example, you know, like trying to focus? all those can be mechanics too and can be part of the narrative. So that's kind of like, that's the exciting space, and that's in a way like the new part of the job that is harder to explain. Depending on the size of the company, there are things like story coordinators. There's also things like copy editing, copywriting, and at times you have to do all of them if you work in a small company. But yeah, that kind of like the division between like game writers and narrative designers, I think that is still there. And definitely in bigger companies, it's easier to see that division. But when you're working on smaller games, it all kind of like blends together. And there was one last thing I wanted to say, but I've forgotten. So I'll just pass on, and maybe I'll come back later.
Jumping off on that, I think there are two other fields that are slowly becoming a known thing in terms of games writing. And one of it is naturalization work. There are a lot of foreign companies with really, really good games hoping to promote their work in what is largely a North American market, although that I think is also changing these days. And the contract folks to look over their lines, naturalize them, fix the metaphors, do things that make it more accessible to different backgrounds, which is interesting work unto itself, honestly. I've done a little bit of that, and it is incredibly complicated to, retain the voice of the original creation while also giving them what you're hoping to get. So that's one. And there's a lot of work in the tie-in fiction universe, I think. Magic the Gathering, World of Darkness, Warhammer 40K. There are a lot of companies looking to have books and novellas and audio dramas made of the creations. And crap, just like Clara, I had one more thing I wanted to say, and it's completely flown out. It's mine, and so we're passing it
That's
over
okay.
to
This
Fahmi.
is super free form for Clara and Cass. If they come back, feel free to jump in. I'm sure we won't mind.
I think as someone who mostly worked as indie, I'm not the best person to answer this, because if you want to ask me like how to define the narrative designer work, I never call myself narrative designer until I finished Coffee Talk and I realized, wait, I was the game designer and the story writer. Does that make me a narrative designer? I guess I am. So that's how I started calling myself narrative designer. The thing is, when you're working in a very small team with only one writer and maybe some other people helping out with editings and copywritings, the storytellers are like, you are either the game designer telling stories or writers adding some lines of gameplay in your stories. That's a really questionable answer.
Yeah, and I think, I'm just gonna hop in really quickly to put in my 2 cents when it comes to, the landscape for these things. I think it's, and I think Clara was hinting at this earlier, when it comes to narratives in games, it's not something that has been around for as long as other aspects of game making. And I think because of that, the sort of like infrastructure when it comes to getting into this and the roles and responsibilities are sort of, they differ from company to company and from project to project. So I think a big part of working in that part of games is flexibility and being able to do all sorts of things and knowing sort of the difference between what is narrative design and the script writing part of it, knowing how to do that well and knowing how to, craft good characters and good dialogue and good plots and stuff like that. And, knowing that is separate, but not unrelated to the narrative design of the game. I think knowing that relationship is really, really important. And being able to work within that is a really, really useful skill. And I think that, yeah, please, Clara.
So yeah, like I think I remember what we had to say, which is very important, which is a bit of like the job of a game writer, narrative designer. We need a bit of respect for it too, and because I'm seeing this in the questions, already, that at times, everybody thinks that they can write because they know how to put words together, and it's like that's not storytelling. There is a craft that goes in there that often, our work as game writers and narrative designers gets kind of, not taken for granted because people think that they can do it too. This happens to game design as well. Everybody thinks that they can design a game, and everybody thinks that they can write a story. And I think that that's also kind of important to highlight that as game writers, we have to defend that what we do is a craft and that is specialized too. But
yeah, thank you for standing up for us, Clara. But so on that note, I think a really interesting thing to talk about, or a good segue into the next question, I think pertains to a lot of people who maybe have done and have worked and have written in more traditional mediums. So people who are comfortable with film and television, people who write a lot of prose, people who do, and create stories in those forms, are probably familiar with things like good characterization and, how do you thread a plot together and things like that. And I think for the three of you, I would love to know what your response is to, how applicable are those tools, how do they transfer over from those mediums, like writing for books and writing for film and television and movies, if and how do they transfer over to writing for games, and if they don't transfer over, what other skills are really useful to hone when it comes to writing for games?
I can start with the things that don't.
Okay.
Cassandra, go. You go, and then I'll go with what it doesn't.
Refuse. You made a noise. It's you.
Okay, so I think that Cassandra's probably a better person to explain how it transfers, but I can tell you it doesn't transfer. Because at times, some of my students come from dramatic writing or screenwriting, right? So there are a lot of things that will transfer, like, world building, dialogue writing, things like those. But one of the first is that knowing the formats. I think that in screenwriting, like especially for film, like knowing what the formats and the conventions are is very important. And that is important for games too, and writing cutscenes. But most of us write dialogue and descriptions and things that happen on spreadsheets. So love the spreadsheet. That's one thing. I think that another thing that kind of goes out of the window when you write dialogue is this idea that the Aristotelian concept of writing dialogue, like something has to, like every character has to speak, in a specific way that it's identifiable, and that line that they say, they can only be the ones to say it and nobody else. They kind of be interchangeable. And if you've taken any creative writing or the dramatic writing classes, that's one thing that they kind of hammer you over the head. And then in games, we have to give choices to the players about what they want to do, what they want to say, how they want to say it. And a lot of those, that kind of like craft that you've learned for years of schooling kind of goes out of the window. So there are things that, in terms of like format, in terms of like how much room do you leave for the player to be themselves. You are basically creating a story where the player is an actor without a script. So how do they know what to do? Something that actors would know from having a director, theater director, film director, that you don't really have. So I think that's one thing that is different. There's two kind of main areas that I always encourage my students to kind of cultivate when coming to games. On the one hand is kind of like choice, narrative choice design, like how to write choices and how to write interactive dialogue. As something that like changes, you have it in like visual novels, you have it in role-playing games, but you have it in a lot of different genres too. And that's a whole, space of narrative design that is very interesting. And on the other hand is also how to write interactive environments, how to write a space, how to tell stories with a space, how to anticipate what the player is going to try to do and give them an interesting response. This is a bit biased because, coming from adventure games and loving adventure games, there's one thing that happens a lot, like you go around and you pick up things and you try to do something and what happens, right? And those are two things that there's bits of traditional storytelling that can do it too, but that idea of interacting, that idea of creating a performative space needs to be kind of trained and nurtured, if that makes sense.
It really does. It's kind of interesting that you said that. I think in a weird way, that was one of the biggest challenges I felt when I went into game writing. when you write a book, it's almost an unspoken agreement between you and the reader. It is you telling the reader there is a story. It is going along a linear fashion. We might change POVs, we might go different places, we might go where you do not expect. But there is a point A and there is a point B, and we're going to get there together. And getting over that mentality was a fascinating challenge on a lot of levels, because games, at least for me, have always felt like handing somebody a novel and telling them, all right, you can go wherever you want, you can wander off from the plot. And then the challenge there and the skill, I think, becomes knowing how to just kind of gently guide the player back in the direction you want them to go, especially if you're talking about a single player campaign. And moving them back onto that trajectory without causing them to think that you're forcing them along that path. And doing that right is such a difficult thing. It is absolutely marvelous. BioWare did it really well with their games. It's incredible. There are a few things from, I think, traditional publishing that one can draw into video games work. Character design, world building especially. You kind of get used to the idea of building things really quickly when all you really have is text to convey a sense of place to the reader. But that said, there is a lot less stuff, I think, that translates well. Game writing and narrative design is an entirely separate field unto itself. I know a lot of folk have talked about how if they kind of fail off novel writing, for example, they can be game writers. And there is nothing further from the truth. It's a completely unique field. It benefits from having knowledge in other adjacent fields, but that knowledge is not essential, and sometimes it can genuinely trip you up.
Yeah, as for me, my only professional experience as writer is being a journalist and being a marketing and PR person, which is like a very different kind of telling stories, right? And one thing I found out is not really like, it's kind of cheating for me. It's like, I don't know how to tell stories like the writers do. I don't know how script writers tell stories. I don't know how novelists tell stories. But I know that every time I promote something with dialogues, I did it better than if I just like wrote something traditionally. That's why I cheat by making games about dialogues. I'm making games that are focused on talking between each other, because I won't know how to do any either way. It's very cheating.
No, I think that's also really, really helpful. That's a really helpful perspective, Fahmi. Just, I think I definitely agree with what Clara was saying earlier about, how, this is something that has to be taken seriously. It's, a lot of, people are very loosey-goosey about it, and they're like, oh yeah, I like writing, so I'm sure I can write for video games. And then that's, might not always translate, that might not always be true. But on the other hand, you also don't have to be somebody who has been trained, who has spent years and years and years writing, in other mediums or in other forms, or are incredibly comfortable telling, stories in a specific way, to take the plunge. You can do that, and something beautiful still can come out. And I guess what I'm saying is, be brave, everybody, be brave. And that, Clara, you mentioned something really, earlier on that I really want to latch onto, which is spreadsheets. And that sort of brings me to the next question. For people who are interested in writing for games, in whatever capacity that might present itself, how do you do that? What tools do you use? Because you mentioned a spreadsheet, right? And I think you mentioned Twine earlier as well. So for someone who's completely blind, who has absolutely no idea, what tools are available out there, or what makes the most sense to start with, do you guys have any piece of advice for people in that situation?
But there's usually a suite of tools, as I was saying before. I think that in screenwriters, you should at least be familiar with screenwriting format and a screenwriting tool. Like there's people who write them in Word, but it's very clunky. People use Final Draft. I've never used Final Draft, but there's other tools. I use Scrivener, for example, because it allows me a bit of flexibility. Writer Duet, there's Highland, there's like a bunch of screenwriting tools that are not as expensive as Final Draft. So knowing that, then being familiar with at least one tool that writes, choice-based, storytelling. Twine is a popular one, is very accessible. Inkle and Ink from Inkle students, Ink is becoming very popular. It's also very accessible and it's more programmery, but it's also very powerful. If being familiar with something like a visual novel format, like Fungus, which is a plugin for Unity, or RenPy, and this is kind of all going a bit into the kind of programmery side. And if one wants to write for games, I know it's scary, but at least being familiar with how to write an if statement and conditionals in programming goes a long way. If you are if you want to be a game writer and you're kind of like, oh, but I don't know anything about programming, it's not that you have to be a programmer. I'm not a programmer. I don't think that anybody here is like, I am programmer, but you have to know how programming works, and you have to know how to communicate with programmers. And you have to not be scared of variables and conditionals and subroutines and things like those, because it's part of your tool set. And not understanding that is not, it's like being a screenwriter who doesn't understand how a movie, is shot and film production works, is part of your tool. So yeah, I think that, knowing that is essential. But yeah, spreadsheets, like, we do so many things on spreadsheets, and not only writing. It's like I've worked in production and QA and everything spreadsheets. So yeah, just learning a bit of how that works and how to transform things into like, XML code or things that are readable by a program is also kind of important.
I think Clara covered most of it that I wanted to talk about, but one thing that I've really, really enjoyed using in terms of getting my mind around the idea of branching dialogue in particular is the Neverwinter Nights editor. It's incredibly well formatted. It's really easy to learn. There are a bunch of weird little bugs and things like that, but ultimately it's a really good tool to mess around with, especially since you can almost build an entire, well, you obviously can, an entire game within context of the editor. Definitely recommend that one for somebody who is not used to things. And like Clara said, it is also really important to get used to the idea of variables and like basic programming stuff. It's not necessarily going to be a large part of your work, especially if you want to get into AAA and things like that, because every company, from what I can tell, has their own separate engines and own separate methodologies. But you're going to be in a better space. Your designers are going to like you a lot more, and you'll definitely have more material for pushing your own ideas if you know basic programming.
So yeah, my favorite tool is probably a notebook and Evernote, which I use to like just jot down idea. The difference is I feel smarter if I use notebook. And then I also use a lot of spreadsheets. In fact, in Coffee Talk, we actually use Fungus, but I specifically requested our programmer to make a system that allows me to convert the spreadsheets directly into Fungus, so I don't need to open Unity at all. Not everybody have that privilege. I was using that privilege of mine, so I don't need to open Unity at all. And then for my next game, I'm actually trying to use Yarn Spinner. It's being used by the folks who made Night in the Woods, but I'm just getting started, so I'm really curious on how this thing will go. If not, I will just go back to spreadsheet.
Yeah, spreadsheets seem like just a favorite all around. I think everybody uses those. Thank you for the answers. Those are really, really insightful into the process of writing for games. I think that's been really useful. So we've sort of covered the why and we've sort of covered the how. I kind of want to touch a little bit. I know we don't have that much time, but I want to talk a little bit about the what. And I'm curious to hear what everyone's responses to the adage, write what you know, is. You know, when it comes to, you know, the stories that, you know, you should be telling. Is there a should be when it comes to storytelling? You know, what sort of stories are accessible to you? And how do our identities come into play with regards to that? I think the angle that I'm sort of coming at for this is, you know, I think a lot of people who are, you know, watching this panel, you know, myself included, come from a Southeast Asian background, right? We grew up here, at least in the region. But the media that we consume and a lot of the games that we play aren't really set in a location like this. So I think, you know, yeah, what are your relationships to the adage, write what you know? Oh, and I see Yukiko telling us
You
running out of
should.
time.
No, there's like around 15 minutes left, so maybe finish up this last part, then Q&A.
Okay, so maybe
Sorry.
no,
Sorry.
don't apologize, please. So this is the final question, and then we'll get on to Q&A. So yeah, take it away.
Well, this one should be its own panel, really. I'll try to keep it short. I think that for games, I've never written what I know. But what you know is what you know emotionally. It's like people that you know, the kind of dramatic situations that you know. But for example, you know, one of the most fun that I had writing for a game was making a game about Singapore with, you know, a team of students from Singapore. And I had been to Singapore and I had actually a couple of times already. And then the last time I was there, I had actually been taking notes and like getting ready for this game and you know, like getting to know Singapore as a world for a game. And I think that what we're missing a bit, and kind of like piggybacking on something that Cassandra mentioned before, I think that in the process of localization and kind of like we're trying to erase the national identity and like the right what you know and the specificity, which is what kind of can make other media really compelling. So I think that in localization, one of the tensions is like how much do you give as context for the player to understand, you know, what it is to be somebody who's not them, you know, and there's also the kind of the issue of diversity that we have a lot of like white men brooding as protagonists and like we want to see other faces in video games. And, you know, like that kind of diversity of experiences, you know, when we do localizations or where we're trying to cater to what marketing things sells. And I think that that's one of the big things that as you know, narrative designers, we fight against a lot, is that marketing decides this is what it's going to sell. And that's not always what might be an interesting story or what tells the story from an interesting point of view.
I think it's important to write what you know when you can, and to constantly push for that diversity whenever possible, whenever it's reasonable within context of a larger team, especially if you're not from North America, if you're not from the UK. Whether it comes true or not, whether you get shot down by the higher ups, it doesn't matter. But being willing to create this story is a phenomenally important thing. And moving on from that, if you're writing what you don't know, and honestly, you're allowed to write what you don't know either, but you have a responsibility to whatever the medium is, whatever the background is, whatever the world is, to research to the point you're sick of it, and to touch base with people from that culture, from that background, to ensure that you are addressing things kindly and you're addressing things in a way that does not bring up cultural trauma or even personal trauma, because it's very easy to look at something. And I completely blame Hollywood for this. We were so desensitized to a lot of things. We're so used to racist shortcuts being normal that we kind of internalize it, whether we like it or not. And every time we work on a project that is not our own marginalization. And even when we're talking about our own marginalizations, because there are a lot of ways to experience it, you have a responsibility to do due diligence.
Okay, so write what you know. The ironic thing is that when I started working on Coffee Talk, I realized that I don't know how to write about my people, about my background, because I've been exposed too much to the Western media and Japanese media. And so what I ended up doing is like mixing both things I know, present it in a setting that, to be honest, I never been to Seattle, but I wrote a game about Seattle, which is surprisingly pretty difficult. Not surprisingly, but it is difficult. But yeah, it helps me to get in the mood. Like, okay, so this is how it works. At least now I know how to write what I've been exposed to. For my next game, I'm working on something that is set in my country, and I found out that it's way harder than writing for the places that are available in other video games, because I don't know like what can I present about my country that will be relatable to other people. Will they be like too alienated about the stories, or it's something that, to be honest, every writers will always try to find the golden position. Like, we will never reach the perfect position for that, but we can always like try redo again, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Nobody's perfect. I think holding yourself up to that standard as well is unreasonable. But I think if effort is put into, you know, making these things as sensitive, or, you know, doing the research and really respecting whatever it is, whatever influences you are drawing from, I think as long as the work's done there, that's enough. I think. But yes, okay, so we've run out of time. We've got to take questions now. I think this is when I'm supposed to hand it back to
Yes,
Gwen.
me. Thank you. Thanks, awesome panelists, for your opinions and thoughts so far. Actually, this is a very good time to segue into the Q&A. For Clara, actually, from Krishan, how do you approach designing culturally motivated narratives that are still accessible to people across multiple cultures? Because I know Fahmi mentioned it, but like, is there a how?
I don't know if there's a how. Hi, Christian. I still need to finish playing your game. So yeah, I think that part of it is that, you know, you have to be able to know what makes your game and your culture, what part of your culture you want to kind of transmit, and how, and what will help others kind of understanding this. And, you know, like, it's funny because I've made games about, you know, I made a game with the Spanish National Ballet about what their values were, and what, you know, it was a world that was completely foreign to me, but they had a set of values that they wanted to kind of transmit, and kind of distilling what is it that could come across in a game, and how, you know, using, you know, the dialogue, the narrative design, and the game itself. You know, I think that it's a matter of abstraction. It's a matter of finding what that core is. Working on Stranded in Singapore, it was very interesting to see, you know, what the team, you know, the people who came from Singapore, what they wanted to transmit as this is Singapore. And, you know, it was very kind of interesting to kind of thread the line between like who was going to be represented, you know, like who, you know, and we realized that at the beginning the team kind of tended to have mostly men, and I'm like, where are the women here? There's women in Singapore too, so what kind of women can we have? You know, like that kind of like basic question. But then it was very interesting to see some people, you know, like people from the UK who lived in Singapore, who thought that part of what we were portraying was like parochial, because we had, you know, uncles and aunties, you know, like very grumpy. And I was like, oh, it's a stereotype. It's like, it's a stereotype. Like, how do we make this, you know, these people real people, and not just a stereotype, but also representative of all the different, you know, economic range of Singapore too, right? And I think that there was the kind of like foreign, like, this is how you should portray your country. And like me being a foreigner as well and looking from the outside in, like that kind of like negotiation of like, how do you want to portray your country? How do we make that clear? But how do we not fall into stereotypes or like it's always that tension. So I don't think that there's just a how. It's a lot of questions that you have to ask yourself. But I think that maybe Fami and Cass also have answers to this, because you know, like this is like a very specific thing. They might have better questions, better answers than me.
I'm going to bounce in for this one because finally I have an answer that I actually like bouncing around in my head. It's not quite related to video games, but in terms of making something that is different, more culturally accessible, I think I managed to do it with my first book series, Rupert Wong, Cannibal Chef. And it's kind of this splatter punk urban fantasy / horror thing with a former triad member who ends up a cook for a bunch of ghouls in Malaysia. And what I did was I stole a lot of the flavor and a lot of the voice from traditional urban fantasy, things like Carrie Dresden, the Sand and Slim series. I borrowed a lot from what is a really Eurocentric field. And I just kind of made my dude as Malaysian as possible. Every time he had a difficult moment, he just kind of wandered off to play para, to go to the mama. And when he's addressing the reader directly, he just calls everyone Angmo constantly. And so you have this weird dissonance where on one hand, he sounds a lot like everyone else in the urban fantasy field, but he is incredibly Malaysian. It did not land with every audience. There were a few people who were very annoyed that I used the Angmo word very frequently. But there were a lot of people who used the familiarity of the urban fantasy tropes to kind of wiggle into this world that was entirely Malaysian. So I think it matters to find what you think would resonate with, say, a North American audience and build on that, give it its own spin.
Okay, Fami, do you want to say anything or we can move on? Okay, cool. So, to everyone from Timothy, how important is game development experience in becoming a good narrative designer for games?
Let me answer to that. Personally, I think it's pretty important, especially if we're talking about game design skill, because narrative design mostly is about how to tell stories in an interactive space. And being able to master those interactive space requires you some basic knowledge of how to be a game designer. And I think at least try to design your own game, or maybe like try to think about how you can tell stories inside a space that you can control. Basically, game designer, artist, if you want like some basic knowledge about artists, like how to draw, how to make objects that will be able to tell stories. Those are the things that will help you in becoming a narrative designer.
Anyone else wants to take that?
Yeah, I think
Is
that
it the how
Fami
important
just
is
got
the,
it.
oh, sorry.
Oh, I think that Fami just got it. I think that it's, you know, knowing what the tools are and what your limitations are and being able to kind of work within those limitations, because we think that computers are magical and we come up with stories and it's like, there's a programmer that will do it, you know, and computers can only do so much well. So I think that that's very important too. And yeah, I think that you know, in relation with what I was saying before, that's kind of like a respect of the narrative design. I think that there should also be respect from the developers, and not, there's many people who want to write for games because they're like, well, I don't know how to program or do art, so I'll do the writing. I think we were talking about this when we were preparing, right? And you know, like, no, you should also know parts of that if you want to do your job well.
I don't think you necessarily need to have game development experience when you start. You could probably go in fresh. But having said that, if you're going to want to go in fresh without any game development experience, you want to be able to study. You want to be ravenous. You want to look up all of the GDC videos. You want to research what people have said on that. It's okay to go in cold, but you're definitely going to need to learn as you go.
Nice. I think that also answers some of the questions from like what tips would you give to a fresh face trying to get in the games industry as a writer? Right. So yeah. Is that something that you want to add on? Because Cassandra pretty much mentioned some of it in her previous answer. No? Okay, cool. Then we can move on to the next question, probably the last question. Yeah. Okay, so to all panelists from Adi Wijaya, what do you think about players that skip the narratives in games? And how do you deal with it?
I think they're missing out.
Oh,
go. You went first.
Honestly, I don't care, because at the end of the day, when a product leaves your hands, it is the property of the player. They get to experience it however they want. They get to enjoy it however they want. It'd be really strange if somebody skips the narrative on, say, a visual novel, but you know what? You do you. But if you're talking about AAA experiences, it's entirely legit. Some people just like to shoot in a cool world, and that's up to them. And to sneak a little bit from what Kara said, I feel like you're losing out if you don't drink up the narrative. But you know what? You enjoy life however you want. Life is short.
Yes, I was saying, it's like, I think that they're missing out. I think that we've also, games have got players used to the possibility of being able to skip it. You know, I think that this idea that the narrative is the flavor. I think that I saw the word flavor on the chat, and that's a word that as a narrative designer kind of annoys me a bit, because I think the narrative is like the stock. It's not the flavor. It's like it's the marrow. It's like it's something that can hold the game together, and like what, you know, the narrative, not only just the cutscenes. And skipping the cutscenes, if you skip a cutscene because it's been made to be flavor, like a decoration, then in a way, like, yes, you're missing out. You're missing out on the world and understanding the context. I remember many years ago, somebody was showing me, I think it was Audience Sphere, and they saw the cutscenes and they're like, I'm just going to skip this because it's just flavor. And turns out that in the cutscene that gave them the background of the game, they also missed like half of the tutorials. So they didn't know how to play the game because the game had interwoven them, and they didn't know, especially the cooking, which is kind of key to Audience Sphere. This person, I just like skipped it, and then I'm like, oh, this game sucks. And I was like, no, it's just that you skipped the part where they were teaching you how this part of the world works, but not as a tutorial, but as a story. And I think that that's, you know, like in a way, like we also have to educate our players to understand that the game is not only the systems, the winning, but like that we're providing a context for them to understand it and like feel that they're part of this world.
So personally, I think if you already have the game, you can do whatever you want. And the fact that there's a feature to skip the cutscene, it means that you are allowed to do it. It's part of the accessibility. I even find it weird that I don't know whether you have played Coffee Talk or not, but it's basically a visual novel. And I found out there are people who bought the game and don't play the story. They just play the game to, one, play around with the latte art, which is very, I was like, oh, okay, you do you. And then there are other people who run the game just to like let the background go. It's like they just want to enjoy the environment, the vibe. They just want a screensaver and they bought the game. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong about that. And it kind of saddens me, but at least you bought the game.
Well, okay. Thank you so much for your answers. I think as an audio person, I can definitely relate to people that want to play the game on mute. So thank you so much for your answers, and thank you, Nick, for moderating. So is there anything else? If not, I'll just close this. Cool. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cassandra, Clara, Fahmi, Nicholas, for the awesome panel.